Well, the JCCF is so important and it's been around for so long. You really are the granddaddy of civil liberties groups. But by another token, you're the baby because you started long after the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and some of those other groups were around. They just stopped working. Like, I literally cannot tell you the last time Canadian Journalists for Free Expression did anything fighting for freedom. They don't even put out a tweet or a statement about censorship like C63. You know, I used to be a member of PEN Canada. What's the point? They never talk about censorship in Canada. What do you think about the state of civil liberties?
Well, in a similar vein, when the government's grossly violated our freedoms of association, conscience, religion, peaceful assembly, and so on, with the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates or vaccine passports, basically mandatory vaccination policies, we saw the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and other civil liberties groups basically embraced the government's narrative on lockdowns and vaccine passports, basically supported those things. They took issue with that some people were suffering worse harms than others. So if you were dark-skinned, female, LGBTQ, handicapped, you're going to suffer worse from lockdowns than if you are male, light-skinned, etc. That's the only thing really that they went on, but they fundamentally supported, or at least did not oppose, these horrific violations of our fundamental charter freedoms that dragged on for literally years. And but you know what? It doesn't matter. You've got lots of people watching The Rebel, and I think other independent media are growing, and that's very positive that all of these independent media outlets are growing. And the Justice Center's received tremendous support, and we're ready to enter into 2025 fighting very hard.
Well, I mean, I take your point about it doesn't matter, but I think what you mean is despite that, I mean, because all those things matter deeply. And I was going to talk about the civil liberties bonfire of the pandemic because, of course, that's what spurred the birth of the Democracy Fund. And that was really the JCCF, the Justice Center's time to shine. Unfortunately, some of the cases that you took have been ignored and downplayed. Like, I can't believe, for example, one of the most shocking violations of civil liberties in recent memory in Canada, when if you were not jabbed, you could not get on a plane or a train or a ferry in this country, second largest country in the world, cold country. You can't just drive across Canada in the winter. I mean, from coast to coast. The airlines didn't want that policy. There was no medical basis for that policy. They didn't respect exemptions for religious or health reasons. They didn't give you credit if you had got the virus and recovered naturally and thus had strong natural immunity. You and a number of very interesting plaintiffs put together a very meticulous lawsuit. You deposed government bureaucrats and got astonishing admissions. And yet the courts in this country said, it's over, so it's moot, so we're not going to trouble your pretty little minds with this. It's not of interest to the public. We're not going to hear the case because it's all over. That's basically what they said, didn't they?
Yes. It's the silver lining on the cloud is that because of the court actions, we got admissions from government officials saying under oath that there was no medical or scientific basis to support these travel mandates. That's an admission we would have never received from the prime minister or any cabinet minister or any provincial premier at a news conference, but it was through the court action, through one of our court actions in Saskatchewan. We had a admission from a government official under oath that if somebody died in a car crash, when he's brought to the hospital, they run a COVID test on the corpse, and if they through PCR testing, if it's a positive test, they list that as a COVID death. We got that through litigation. So it's been, on the one level, it's been very discouraging. On another level, it's been a good tool for getting at the truth and showing just how pathetic and miserable and weak the government's evidence is in these court challenges to lockdowns.
I take your point. So on one hand, we learned the awful truth about our government, but on the other hand, they learned they can get away with it. Um, so many of the precedent-setting cases that I would have thought would have been slam dunks for freedom, the courts found some excuse to let it slouch by. It was almost like they found a pandemic exemption in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that the judges went out of their way to find some angle to permit the greatest infringement of civil liberties in a generation. I think while you and I may have learned something about the nature of government, government learned something about the nature of checks and balances on them, which is they really, I mean, the Emergencies Act, finally, it was found to be unconstitutional illegal by the federal court more than a year later, by the way, but, or a year later, that is. But other than that, I can't think of a single important case that the civil liberties side won. Can you, like a single substantive case about, you know, a labor union agreement or a mask bylaw or these insane arrive-can lawsuits? I cannot think of an important blow for liberty. All the bad stuff was rubber stamped. Am I missing? Was there some case other than the Emergencies Act? Did I miss something where the bad guys might have lost for once?
We've had minor and partial victories here and there, but unfortunately, I have to agree with you. Substantively, the court rulings the last 2 or 3 years in regards to the lockdowns of vaccine passports have been atrocious. I'm addressing this by way of a book, which you and I have had a few discussions about. It's called Corrupted by Fear: How the Charter Was Betrayed and What Canadians Can Do About It. It's going to be available January 15th. And I am criticizing, going through what was the evidence that was put before the courts and how the courts have, in many cases, they've ignored the evidence that was placed before them. Judges have made assertions in their ruling that are just repeating what they heard on the 6 o'clock news. Yeah. And we've had court rulings where the judge says, well, the government's evidence is more persuasive, but they don't say how or why they believe the government's evidence to be more persuasive, which makes for a very poor judgment, because if you're going to accept one side's evidence as stronger, better, more persuasive than the other, regardless of which side, but you owe it to justice and you owe it to the people, to citizens, to explain how you arrived at that conclusion. And it's rather ominous and dangerous when you've got court rulings that say, well, you know, we think the government's evidence is more persuasive. And there's not a sentence in the court judgment explaining why or how the government's evidence is more persuasive. So this book is part of an effort. It's part of a already in existence widespread effort to hold the judiciary to account over betraying the Charter. And with that public awareness, that is, over the long run, is going to trickle up towards the appointment of better judges, as we've seen south of the border in recent decades. Very slow, very gradual trend towards appointing judges that have a greater appreciation for freedom.
Well, I hope that happens in Canada too. In Donald Trump's first term, there were some mistakes and some missed opportunities, but I think a lot of people would agree, by working with the Federalist Society, which is a freedom-oriented fraternity of lawyers, they managed to make such outstanding appointments. Obviously, the Supreme Court appointments are the most important, but I think that's a terrible contrast to Canada, where Stephen Harper, when he was PM, he really had the chance to remake the Supreme Court forever, and he never thought about it. I think that was probably the greatest missed opportunity of his prime ministership. Hopefully, if Pierre Poilievre becomes PM next year, he'll take a different approach. He'll realize that that is the greatest opposition to any freedom-oriented government, not the opposition, not the media, but the courts. Anyways, listen, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the COVID pandemic, because you and I have talked about that many times before, and I know we've chewed these things over with our viewers. The JCCF has a lot of work to do post-pandemic too, just like the Democracy Fund does. And I want to talk about some of those cases. I printed off a few different stories from your website before I sat down here. Here's one, and I'd like your help on this because I haven't spent a lot of time on this subject. Danielle Smith, who I know has come to a lot of Justice Center events, so she's certainly sympathetic. she has introduced something she calls the Alberta Bill of Rights, or maybe she's reintroduced it. And your headline is Steps Forward, Steps Backward in Bill 24 Changes to the Alberta Bill of Rights. Let me ask you, what does the Bill of Rights, proposed Alberta Bill of Rights, say? Why did the Premier bring it in? And how can it be improved if there are flaws to it?
Okay, so the Alberta Bill of Rights has been the law in the province of Alberta for several decades.
Okay.
In recent times, it's clearly being ignored by the courts. So it's similar to the charter. It says every Albertan has the fundamental right, free speech, freedom of conscience, religion, association, assembly, so on and so forth. And it says that every law in Alberta must be interpreted and applied in a way that respects these fundamental freedoms. So it's good to have in place, but the courts ignored it. In the case of Sheila and Annette Lewis, they said, well, we're just going to do a charter analysis. We're not going to pay attention to the Alberta Bill of Rights. A very similar outcome in the Ingram decision, which was one of the Justice Centre's cases where the court ended up invalidating Alberta's lockdown measures. So the background is the courts were ignoring the Alberta Bill of Rights. Danielle Smith's UCP government brought in Bill 24 to improve it. The first draft of Bill 24, we said it's not great because you've got this language in there that's just like the charter that says that these rights can be limited, subject to, reasonable limits, as can be demonstrably justified in a free society. So we pushed back on that and said, well, at least change that language to get requirement for evidence, which we didn't see much with all the charter rulings regarding lockdowns. So Bill 24 was amended to get some better language in there. At the end of the day, I always go back to what really matters more than the wording of the charter or the wording of the Bill of Rights is our culture. Do we have a freedom-loving culture? If yes, that's going to trickle up to the politicians, the lawyers, the judges. And so we think the Bill 24 was a small step forward. However, in the bigger context, what really matters is that we educate Canadians of all ages, especially the younger ones, but Canadians of all ages, we need to really appreciate our charter rights and freedoms and the free society. If we don't, then it doesn't matter what the wording is of the Alberta Bill of Rights or the Canadian Bill of Rights or the charter.